This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. If you dance this waltz, I'll marry you. The words landed like a joke dressed in gold, light enough to make people laugh, heavy enough to make the room turn its head, and for a brief second, even the soft hum of conversations beneath the crystal chandeliers seemed to hesitate as Alexander Hayes leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over polished mahogany, a glass of 12-year bourbon catching the warm amber light, his smile sharp, effortless, practiced, the kind of smile that had closed deals worth hundreds of millions, and ended conversations before they began. And around him, the table erupted exactly as expected, laughter spilling out in waves, a few amused glances thrown toward the waitress as if she were part of the evening's entertainment, just another detail in a room designed to impress. But Emily Carter didn't laugh. She didn't flinch, didn't even shift her weight as she stood there holding a silver tray steady in one hand, her posture straight, her expression calm, as if she had heard something entirely different from everyone else, something quieter, something more revealing. And for a moment, if anyone had bothered to look closely, they might have noticed the way her eyes lingered, not on the man, not on the money, but on the space between his words, where arrogance often hid behind humor. But no one was looking closely, because men like Alexander Hayes were used to being the center of gravity in any room, especially this one, a five-star restaurant perched 20 floors above Manhattan, where the skyline stretched like a painting and the air smelled faintly of truffle oil and polished success, where waitstaff moved like shadows and billionaires spoke like they owned the clock itself. And tonight, Alexander was in rare form, fresh off a deal that had just pushed his net worth past 9 figures again, surrounded by friends who measured worth in contracts and competition, each one eager to push the evening further into spectacle. "Come on," one of them added, tapping the table with a grin. "You made the offer, at least give her the music," another chimed in, pulling out a phone, already scrolling, already turning the moment into something larger than it needed to be, something public, something performative, because that was how power entertained itself, by turning ordinary people into unexpected stages. But Emily still didn't move. Not immediately. She simply placed the tray down on the nearest empty table with a quiet precision that went unnoticed by most, except for one man who, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, found himself watching that small, deliberate motion instead of the laughter around him. And Alexander's smile lingered, but something in his eyes flickered, just for a second, curiosity slipping in, where certainty had been, because she hadn't reacted the way people usually did. There was no awkward chuckle, no quick apology, no eager attempt to please, just stillness. And then, finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear, cutting cleanly through the noise without needing to rise. "Which version?" And the question hung there, simple, precise, completely unexpected, and the laughter didn't stop all at once. It stumbled, broke apart, as if the room itself needed a second to understand what she meant. And Alexander tilted his head slightly, the faintest crease forming between his brows, because suddenly the rules of the game had shifted, just enough to make him aware that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who knew how to play. "Version," he echoed, a hint of amusement still in his tone, but now layered with something else, something thinner, something sharper. And Emily met his gaze, not boldly, not defiantly, but steadily, like someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. "The classical Viennese, or the American smooth?" she asked. And there it was, the first crack, small but undeniable, because that wasn't the answer of someone caught off guard. That wasn't the language of someone out of place. And for a brief moment, Alexander Hayes, a man who built empires on prediction, found himself without one. And the room, sensing the shift even if they couldn't name it, grew quieter, the kind of quiet that didn't come from command, but from attention. And somewhere near the back, the pianist, who had been playing softly to fill space rather than command it, slowed his hands, watching, waiting, because something had changed, something subtle but real, like the first drop of rain before a storm. And Emily reached up, not to adjust her uniform, not to fix her hair, but simply to tuck a loose strand behind her ear, a small, human gesture that made her seem even more out of place in a moment that was quickly becoming anything but ordinary. And Alexander leaned forward now, elbows resting lightly on the table, his interest no longer casual, no longer detached. "Surprise me," he said, the words softer this time, stripped of their earlier mockery. And for the first time that night, he wasn't performing for his friends. He wasn't playing to the room. He was watching her, really watching, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized was there. And Emily gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, before turning slightly toward the pianist. And with nothing more than a glance, something passed between them, something unspoken but understood, and then the first notes began, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, and the room held its breath, not because they expected anything extraordinary, but because something in the air told them they were about to see it anyway. The first note stretched through the room like a thread pulled tight, clean and deliberate, and Emily stepped into it without hesitation, her foot gliding across the polished floor with a precision that did not belong to chance, did not belong to a hurried life between tables and tips. And for a brief second, it felt as though the entire restaurant shifted around her, as though the space itself adjusted to accommodate something it had not expected to hold, and Alexander noticed it immediately. Not as a thought, but as a sensation, the way one notices when the temperature in a room changes by just a degree, subtle but undeniable, and he pushed his chair back slowly, rising to his feet almost without realizing it, drawn forward not by obligation, but by curiosity that had begun to sharpen into something more focused, something that did not like being unanswered. And Emily turned toward him, her posture still composed, her expression still quiet. But there was something different now. Something revealed not in her face, but in the way she moved, because the moment her hand lifted slightly, inviting, not demanding, not asking, simply allowing the possibility, the air between them seemed to settle into a rhythm that had nothing to do with the laughter from before. And for the first time that night, Alexander hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for the people around him to notice, long enough for his friends to exchange amused glances that began to fade into something more uncertain, because hesitation was not something they associated with him, not here, not ever, and yet it was there, small but real, before he stepped forward and placed his hand in hers, the contact brief, controlled, but enough to confirm what his instincts had already begun to suspect, that this was not going to unfold the way he had planned. And the music carried them into motion, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a smooth, almost inevitable flow, as if the dance had already been waiting for them before either of them spoke. And Emily led the first step, just enough to guide without overpowering, her movements fluid, grounded, each turn measured with an awareness that extended beyond the floor beneath them. And Alexander followed, at first with the confidence of someone used to leading in every space he entered. But that confidence shifted quickly into concentration as he realized that this was not a game he could dominate through presence alone, because she was not reacting to him. She was anticipating him, adjusting before he completed a movement, correcting before he made a mistake, and there was no show of it, no attempt to impress, just a quiet control that made the dance feel effortless even as it demanded precision. And somewhere near the bar, a glass paused halfway to someone's lips, forgotten, as the room began to watch in a different way, no longer entertained but attentive, drawn into something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. And the pianist, sensing the shift, deepened the tempo slightly, allowing the melody to expand, to breathe, to follow rather than lead. And Emily turned, a clean rotation that caught the light just long enough to reveal the focus in her eyes, not on the crowd, not on the spectacle, but on the movement itself. And Alexander felt it then, the first real disruption in his composure, not embarrassment, not discomfort, but something closer to respect, forming quietly, almost against his will, because she was not trying to win anything. She was not trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what she knew, and doing it well. And that was something he understood on a level that had nothing to do with wealth or status. And yet, even as he adjusted, even as he began to match her timing more closely, there were moments where he misstepped, small, nearly invisible to anyone else, but not to her. And each time, she corrected without breaking rhythm, without drawing attention, and once, just once, as he nearly lost the count, she murmured, barely audible beneath the music, 3, not 4. And there was no judgment in it, no amusement, just clarity, and he followed, because in that moment, following felt less like losing control and more like understanding something new, and the dance continued, expanding outward, filling the space that had once been occupied by noise and expectation, until the room itself seemed to settle into silence again, not forced, not commanded, but chosen. And as they moved through the final sequence, Emily guiding him through a turn that ended with her stepping back just enough to create distance, just enough to complete the pattern. The last note lingered in the air a fraction longer than necessary, and then it was gone, and for a second, no one reacted, no one clapped, no one spoke, because what they had just witnessed did not fit neatly into the categories they were used to, and Alexander stood there, still holding her hand, his breath steady but his thoughts anything but aware in a way he had not been before, not of the room, not of the audience, but of her, of the quiet certainty she carried without needing to announce it. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the room returned, sound rushing back in waves as applause began. Scattered at first, then building, not the loud, careless applause of earlier, but something more deliberate, more genuine, and Alexander released her hand, just slightly, enough to look at her properly, and for the first time that evening, there was no trace of mockery in his expression, only a question he had not yet learned how to ask, and Emily, as if she understood that without needing to hear it, gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged the moment without claiming it, before turning back toward the table where her tray still waited, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The applause lingered longer than anyone expected, not loud, not chaotic, but steady, as if each person in the room needed an extra second to understand why they were clapping, and Alexander Hayes stood in the center of it, still, composed on the outside, but something beneath that surface had shifted in a way he could not immediately define, because he had seen performances before, had funded them, attended them, even dismissed them, but this had not felt like a performance. It had felt like a quiet correction, delivered without a single word, and as Emily Carter returned to her table, lifting the tray with the same calm precision she had shown before, the contrast became almost unsettling, because the room was still reacting while she had already moved on, as if the moment that had just altered everyone else had been, for her, just another step in a longer rhythm. And that thought stayed with him, sharper than any comment his friends could have made, though they did not hold back for long. "Well, that was unexpected," one of them said, trying to laugh, though the edge in his voice gave him away, and another leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "You might actually have to keep your promise now." And that earned a few scattered chuckles, but the laughter did not carry the same weight as before. It did not dominate the room. It did not define it, because something else had already taken that place, something quieter, something harder to ignore, and Alexander did not respond immediately. He simply reached for his glass, paused, then set it back down untouched, his gaze following Emily as she moved between tables, noting details he had not cared to notice earlier. The way she adjusted a place setting without looking down, the way she anticipated a request before it was spoken, the way her presence seemed to organize the space around her without drawing attention to itself. And he realized, with a clarity that felt both obvious and new, that the dance had not been an exception, it had been a glimpse, and that realization did something to him. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like a door opening just enough to let in a different kind of light. And without announcing it, without consulting the expectations of the table around him, he stood, pushing his chair back with a quiet motion that still managed to pull a few curious glances, and he walked toward her, not with the casual confidence he had used earlier, but with a more deliberate pace, one that suggested he was no longer entirely sure how this interaction would unfold. And when he reached her, she had just finished placing a dessert in front of another guest, her attention focused, her movements efficient, and she turned only when he stopped a few feet away, not surprised, not hurried, simply aware. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name for the first time, the formality of it sounding almost unfamiliar in his own voice, and she met his gaze, her expression neutral but not distant. "Yes, sir," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no lingering trace of the dance in her tone, just professionalism, steady and intact. And for a second, he almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but out of recognition, because she had drawn a line without needing to explain it, and he respected that more than he expected to. "Walk with me," he said, then paused, the words catching slightly as he reconsidered. "If you have a minute," he added. The adjustment small but significant, and she studied him briefly, not long enough to be rude, but long enough to measure something beyond the request itself, before giving a slight nod. "I can step away for a moment," she said, and together they moved toward the quieter edge of the dining room. Near the tall windows where the city stretched out below them, lights scattered across the night like a constellation built by human hands, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, just present, until Alexander finally broke it. "You knew exactly what you were doing out there," he said, not accusing, not praising, just stating, and Emily glanced toward the glass, her reflection faint against the city beyond. "So did you," she replied, and he exhaled softly, a sound that almost resembled a laugh but did not quite reach it. "I thought I did," he said, and that admission, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said earlier that night, and she turned slightly, her attention returning to him. "People usually do," she said, "until they do not." And there it was again, that quiet clarity, not confrontational, not defensive, just precise, and Alexander found himself nodding, not because he agreed fully, but because he understood enough to recognize the truth in it. And for a brief moment, the distance between them felt different, not defined by status, not shaped by expectation, but by something else entirely, something still forming, and he leaned lightly against the window, his posture more relaxed than it had been all evening. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" he asked, and the question lingered in the air, not as a demand, but as an invitation, and Emily did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting back toward the room where the music had already returned to its softer background role. And when she spoke, her voice was even, measured. "A long time ago," she said, and nothing more, and Alexander studied her for a second longer, recognizing the boundary in that answer, recognizing the choice behind it. And instead of pushing, instead of turning it into another game to win, he nodded once, accepting what she had given without trying to take more, and that, more than anything else that night, surprised him the most. Emily turned slightly back toward the dining room, the faint reflection of the city lights tracing along the edge of her profile, and for a moment it seemed as though she might excuse herself and return to the rhythm of her shift, but Alexander remained where he was, not blocking her path, not insisting, just present in a way that felt different from before, quieter, and that difference did not go unnoticed by her, because she had spent years reading people not by what they said, but by what they stopped saying, and right now, he was no longer filling the silence with certainty, he was letting it exist, and that alone made her pause. "You are not going to ask again," she said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Alexander shook his head slightly, his gaze steady but no longer probing. "No," he replied. "If you wanted me to know, you would have told me." And there was no challenge in it, no attempt to draw her out, just acceptance. And Emily studied him for a brief second. Longer, measuring the shift, testing its sincerity in the same quiet way she had tested everything else that night. And then she gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if to say that he had, for now, passed a test he did not know he was taking. And she turned back toward the room, but this time she did not step away immediately. Instead, she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the window, her fingers barely touching the glass as she looked out at the city below. "It was not supposed to end like that," she said after a moment, her voice softer, not directed at him entirely, but not hidden either, and Alexander straightened slightly, his attention sharpening without becoming intrusive. "What was not?" he asked, careful now, aware that the space between them required a different kind of approach, and she exhaled slowly, the breath barely visible in the reflection. "The dancing," she said. "It was not supposed to end at all." And there was something in the way she said it, not regret, not bitterness, but a quiet recognition of something unfinished, something that had been interrupted rather than concluded, and Alexander felt that more than he expected, because he understood unfinished things. He built his entire world around finishing them, closing deals, completing cycles, turning uncertainty into certainty. And yet here she was someone who had walked away from something without turning it into a story of failure or triumph, just leaving it as it was, incomplete, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. Injury, he said, not as a guess, but as a possibility drawn from observation. The precision in her movements, the restraint in her control, the way she had never pushed beyond what was necessary. And Emily glanced at him, a brief flicker of surprise crossing her expression before it. Settled again. Partly, she replied, and that was more than she had given before, but still not everything. And he nodded once, accepting it, not pressing further, and that restraint, that willingness to leave space, continued to shift something between them, something subtle but steady, and behind them, the dining room began to reclaim its normal rhythm, conversations rising again, silverware clinking, the pianist returning to a softer melody that filled the background without demanding attention, and Emily straightened, the moment of stillness passing as she returned fully to herself, to the role she had chosen to inhabit for now. I should get back, she said, her tone professional again, but not distant, just grounded, and Alexander did not argue, did not try to extend the moment beyond what it was. Of course, he said, stepping back slightly to give her space, and as she moved past him, there was no dramatic pause, no lingering glance, just a quiet continuation of motion. But something had changed, something that did not need to be named to be real, and he remained by the window for a second longer, watching the reflection of her moving through the room rather than turning to follow her directly, noticing again the consistency in her presence, the way she carried herself with the same quiet control, whether she was dancing or serving. And that consistency drew his attention more than anything else had that night, because it suggested something deeper than talent, something closer to identity. And when he finally returned to the table, his friends were already waiting, their expressions ranging from amused to curious to something that edged toward cautious respect. So, one of them said, leaning forward slightly, "Are you still laughing?" And Alexander took his seat without rushing, his movements measured, deliberate, and for the first time that evening, he allowed a small smile to form, not the sharp, dismissive one from before, but something softer, something that acknowledged rather than deflected. "No," he said simply, and that single word carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have, because it marked a shift that did not need to be defended or justified. It just existed, and as the conversation at the table slowly adjusted to this new tone, less performative, more restrained, Alexander found his attention drifting again, not out of distraction, but out of focus, back to the figure moving steadily through the room. And for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about what he could gain from a person or what role they could play in his world. He was simply trying to understand them, and that, more than anything else, felt unfamiliar and strangely, quietly important. The rest of the evening unfolded with a kind of quiet tension that no one openly acknowledged but everyone adjusted to, as if the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn, and Alexander Hayes found that his usual rhythm had been disrupted in ways that were both subtle and persistent, because even as conversations resumed and deals were casually referenced between bites of perfectly plated entrees, his attention no longer anchored itself to the table with the same certainty. It drifted, returning again and again to the figure moving through the space with an ease that now carried a different meaning. And Emily Carter did not change her pace, did not alter her tone, did not behave as though anything significant had happened, and that, more than anything else, unsettled him further, because he was used to reactions, to shifts, to people recalibrating themselves in response to him. And she had not done that. She had absorbed the moment and moved on, leaving him to process it alone. And as the check was finally placed at the edge of the table, the familiar leather folder, resting where it always did, he reached for it without the usual automatic dismissal, without the quick signature that signaled the end of an interaction, and instead he paused, his fingers resting lightly against the surface as if the simple act required more consideration than before, and one of his friends leaned back, watching him with a half-smile that tried to recover the earlier tone of the evening. "Do not tell me you are still thinking about that dance," he said, attempting humor, but the effort landed differently now, less certain, and Alexander glanced up briefly, his expression calm but not disengaged. I am thinking about what I missed before it, he replied, and the answer, simple as it was, drew a brief silence from the table, because it was not the kind of response they were used to hearing from him, not reflective, not inward, and the conversation shifted again, less performative, more cautious, as if each person was recalibrating their own understanding of what had just taken place. And Alexander closed the folder without signing it immediately, his gaze lifting once more, scanning the room until it found her again, not because he was looking for her, but because his attention had already learned where to settle, and this time, he did not wait. He stood, carrying the folder with him as he crossed the dining room, not with urgency, not with spectacle, just with intention. And Emily noticed him before he reached her, not because she was watching him, but because she noticed everything that shifted in her environment, and she turned slightly, meeting him halfway with the same composed presence she had maintained all night. "Is everything all right with your table?" she asked, her tone professional, steady, and he held out the folder, not passing it to her immediately, but keeping it for a moment longer. "Everything is fine," he said, then added, after a brief pause, "I would prefer to settle it with you." And she accepted the folder with a small nod, opening it with practiced efficiency, her eyes scanning the contents quickly, and when she looked back up, there was no surprise, no curiosity, just acknowledgement. "Of course," she said, and he watched her for a second, noticing again the consistency in her movements, the absence of hesitation, the lack of any attempt to interpret his presence beyond what was necessary, and that steadiness grounded the moment in a way he had not expected. "Do you always return to work this quickly after something like that?" he asked, the question quiet, almost incidental, and she considered it briefly, not because it was difficult, but because she chose her answers with care. "Yes," she said, because the work was never the interruption, and he absorbed that, the meaning settling slowly, reshaping the way he viewed the sequence of events, because for her, the dance had not been a departure from her role. It had been an extension of it, a different expression of the same discipline, and that realization shifted something else in him, something deeper, something that had less to do with curiosity and more to do with respect, and he nodded once, more to himself than to her, before reaching into his jacket and placing a card inside the folder, not with emphasis, not with expectation, just as part of the transaction, and she closed it, her fingers steady, before offering it back. "Thank you," she said, and he accepted it, this time without hesitation, signing with a single smooth motion, and as he handed it back, their eyes met briefly, not long enough to suggest anything beyond acknowledgement, but long enough to confirm that whatever had begun that night had not ended with the music, and as he turned to leave, moving back toward the table where his friends were already gathering their things, preparing to step back into the world that waited for them outside, he found that the room felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had, and when he finally walked out into the cool night air, the city stretching around him in familiar patterns of light and motion, he paused for a second longer than usual before stepping forward, as if measuring something invisible, something newly introduced into the precise calculations that had always defined his life. And inside, behind the glass and the quiet glow of chandeliers, Emily Carter picked up her tray and continued her shift, the rhythm steady, the movement controlled, but somewhere beneath that calm, something had shifted as well, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to matter, enough to carry forward into whatever came next. The night air carried a quiet chill that settled against the edges of the city, and Alexander Hayes stood for a moment longer than necessary beside the black sedan waiting at the curb, its engine humming softly, its driver already stepping out to open the door, but he did not move immediately, his gaze lifting toward the skyline, as if something within it had shifted alignment. And for a man who measured time and decisions and outcomes, the pause felt unfamiliar, almost inefficient, and yet he allowed it, just long enough for the echo of the evening to settle into something more defined, something that refused to dissolve into routine. And when he finally slid into the back seat, the door closing with a quiet, precise sound, he did not reach for his phone as he usually would, did not scroll through updates or messages or numbers that demanded his attention. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his eyes unfocused for a brief second, replaying not the dance itself, but the details surrounding it, the stillness before it began, the absence of hesitation, the way Emily Carter had asked a question instead of reacting, and that question lingered now, not because of the words, but because of what it revealed. And across the city, several blocks away, the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, the last wave of guests beginning to thin, the late hours softening the edges of conversation. And Emily moved through the closing sequence of her shift with the same consistency she had shown all night, clearing tables, resetting spaces, acknowledging quiet thanks with brief nods and measured smiles. And yet beneath that practiced calm, there was a subtle awareness that had not been there before, not distraction, not anticipation, but recognition, as if something had entered her orbit without announcing itself, something she could neither define nor dismiss. And when she finally stepped into the employee corridor behind the dining room, the lighting softer, the sounds more distant, she paused near the lockers, setting her tray down with a controlled motion before reaching into the pocket of her apron and pulling out the folded receipt she had not looked at yet. And for a moment she simply held it, her fingers tracing the edge as if deciding whether to open it at all. And when she did, her eyes moved quickly across the printed total, the signature, and then stopped, not at the number, though it was larger than most, but at the card he had left inside, a simple piece of heavy stock with his name, Alexander Hayes, and beneath it, a number written by hand, not printed, not formal, and she studied it for a second longer than necessary, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet calculation, because gestures like this were not unfamiliar to her. But the way it had been given, without emphasis, without expectation, changed its meaning, and she folded the receipt again, slipping both it and the card back into her apron without comment, as if placing it into a space that would be addressed later, or perhaps not at all. And across town, the car moved steadily through traffic, the city lights sliding past in a familiar rhythm, and Alexander reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing against the empty space where the card had been, and for a brief second, he considered the simplicity of what he had done, a single gesture, minimal effort, something that in his world often led to predictable outcomes. And yet this did not feel predictable. It did not feel like a move in a sequence he had already mapped out. It felt open, unresolved, and that lack of closure did not irritate him as it might have before. It held his attention instead, and he turned his gaze toward the window, watching the reflections shift as the car passed beneath streetlights spaced every few dozen feet, each one marking a moment, a beat, a quiet continuation, and he realized, not suddenly, but steadily, that for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about what would happen next in terms of control or advantage. He was thinking about possibility, and that distinction, small as it seemed, altered the way the night settled around him. And back at the restaurant, Emily changed out of her uniform, the familiar routine grounding her movements, the simple act of folding the apron, placing it in the locker, tying her hair back loosely before stepping out into the cooler air. And when she emerged onto the street, the city greeted her not as a backdrop, but as a living presence, the distant sound of traffic, the muted conversations of passers-by, the steady rhythm of footsteps on concrete, and she began to walk, not quickly, not slowly, just with purpose. Her path taking her past storefronts dimmed for the night, past streetlights that cast soft pools of illumination every 20 feet or so, and as she walked, her hand brushed lightly against the pocket where the card rested, not checking, not confirming, just acknowledging its presence, and she did not take it out, did not examine it again, because whatever it represented did not require immediate action, it required time, and that was something she understood well, the value of waiting, the clarity that came from not rushing toward a conclusion, and as the distance between them grew, measured, in blocks and intersections and quiet decisions, neither of them knew what would come next, but both carried the same subtle awareness, that something had begun not with a declaration, not with a plan, but with a moment that refused to be dismissed, and that was enough to change the rhythm of everything that followed. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of light slipping between buildings and settling across the city in quiet layers, and Emily Carter woke to it the same way she always did, without an alarm, without urgency, her internal rhythm steady, practiced, shaped by years of early shifts and long days. And for a few seconds she remained still, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. The faint hum of distant traffic filtering through the window, grounding her in the familiar, and then she moved, sitting up, tying her hair back loosely as her feet found the cool wooden floor, and nothing about the morning felt different on the surface. The same routine, the same measured pace, and yet, beneath it, there was a subtle shift, not disruptive, not distracting, but present, like a note carried over from the night before that had not yet resolved. And she crossed the room, reaching for the small table where she had placed her bag, her fingers brushing against the fabric before. Slipping inside, not searching, not hesitating, simply aware. And when she pulled out the card, it rested in her hand with a quiet weight that seemed disproportionate to its size, and she looked at it again, not reading the name this time, not focusing on the number, but observing the details she had missed before, the slight indentation where the pen had pressed into the paper, the uneven edge of the handwritten digits, the absence of any additional note, no instruction, no expectation, just contact, and she held it there for a second longer than necessary before placing it back down on the table, not hidden, not displayed, just present, and she turned away, moving toward the kitchen, the rhythm of the morning continuing, coffee brewing, sunlight shifting slightly as it filtered through the blinds, and she did not reach for the card again, not yet, because whatever it represented did not belong to impulse, it belonged to choice. And across the city, several miles away, Alexander Hayes stood in a space defined by glass and steel, his office overlooking the same skyline from a higher vantage point, the floor beneath him polished to a quiet sheen, the air controlled, precise, and he had already been awake for hours, moving through meetings, reviewing numbers, making decisions that would ripple outward through companies and contracts. And yet, even as he spoke, even as he listened, a part of his attention remained elsewhere, not distracted, but divided, as if something had introduced a second layer of awareness that he could not ignore. And when the meeting concluded, his team dispersing with the efficiency that defined his world, he remained by the window, his reflection faint against the city beyond, and he reached into his pocket out of habit, his fingers encountering the absence of the card he had left behind. And for a moment, he considered the simplicity of what came next, a phone call, a message, a direct line that could bridge the distance between intention and action, and yet he did not reach for his phone immediately, because something about the night before had shifted the way he approached even the smallest decisions, and instead he stood there, allowing the moment to exist without filling it. And back in her apartment, Emily finished her coffee, the warmth steady in her hands as she moved toward the door, preparing to step back into the day, and as she reached for her bag, her fingers paused again, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, and she picked up the card once more, this time holding it a little longer, her gaze settling on the number, tracing it silently, committing it not to memory, but to consideration, and then, with a quiet motion, she slipped it into her wallet, not as a promise, not as a plan, but as a possibility, and she stepped outside, the city already in motion, the sidewalks filling with people moving at different speeds, different purposes, and she joined them, her pace steady, her focus forward, and somewhere above, in an office that overlooked the same street she walked, Alexander finally turned away from the window, his hand moving toward his phone, not with urgency, not with certainty, but with a deliberate calm, and he paused, just for a second, before setting it back down again, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that not every connection needed to be controlled. Not every moment needed to be claimed immediately. Some needed to unfold on their own. And as the morning stretched forward, measured in steps and seconds and quiet decisions, both of them moved through the same city, separated by distance, but connected by something that neither had fully defined yet, something that had begun without expectation and continued without pressure. And in that space, something real had room to grow. The day unfolded with a steady rhythm that neither rushed nor slowed. The kind of rhythm that made everything feel predictable on the surface, and yet beneath it, both Emily Carter and Alexander Hayes carried a quiet awareness that refused to settle into routine, and for Emily, that awareness followed her into the diner where she worked her morning shift, a smaller place than the restaurant from the night before, less polished, less formal, but grounded in a different kind of consistency, the kind built on regular customers, familiar orders, and the soft hum of conversations that did not need to impress anyone, and she moved through it with the same calm precision, pouring coffee, sliding plates across the counter, greeting people by name when she knew them and by tone when she did not, and nothing in her behavior suggested distraction, nothing in her posture revealed hesitation, but every now and then, her hand would pause just a fraction longer than usual when reaching for something, as if her thoughts had stepped slightly ahead of her movements, and she would adjust, returning to the present without drawing attention to it. And behind the counter, the morning light filtered through the windows, catching the edges of glass mugs and chrome surfaces, creating small reflections that shifted as the sun climbed higher, and she noticed those details without thinking. The way she noticed everything, the subtle changes in tone, in pace, in presence, and somewhere between refilling a cup and clearing a plate, her mind returned briefly to the card resting in her wallet, not as a question, not as a decision, just as a fact, something that existed alongside everything else, waiting without urgency. And across the city, in a building that rose higher than most, Alexander stood once again at his window, though this time he did not remain there long, because the morning had already demanded his attention in ways that required action, meetings scheduled back-to-back, calls that stretched across time zones, decisions that carried weight beyond the room he stood in, and he moved through them with the same efficiency that had defined his success, his voice steady, his thoughts clear, his focus sharp. And yet, even within that structure, there were moments, small and brief, where his attention shifted not away from the task, but through it, as if part of him was observing something beyond the immediate. And after one such meeting, as his assistant stepped out and the door closed softly behind her, he reached for his phone again, this time not out of habit, but with intention, and he unlocked it, the screen lighting up with notifications he did not immediately address. And instead, he opened a new message, his thumb hovering for a second over the empty space where words would appear, and that pause, though brief, carried more weight than any decision he had made that morning, because it was not about strategy, not about outcome. It was about choice, and he began to type, not quickly, not casually, but with a kind of measured clarity that mirrored the way he had spoken to her the night before. And when he finished, the message was simple, direct, and free of expectation, and he read it once, not to revise, but to confirm that it said exactly what it needed to say and nothing more, before pressing send. And in that moment, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to mark the difference between possibility and action. And miles away, in the quiet flow of the diner, Emily's phone rested in the pocket of her bag beneath the counter, unnoticed at first as the morning continued, orders called out, plates delivered, conversations rising and falling in steady waves, and it was not until a lull, a brief pause between customers, that she stepped back, reaching into her bag to check the time, and the screen lit up as she pulled it free, revealing the message waiting there, and she stilled for a fraction of a second, not out of surprise, but out of recognition, because this was the moment she had known would come, not when, not how, but that it would, and she opened it, her eyes moving across the words with the same quiet focus she brought to everything else. And as she read, her expression did not change. Dramatically, there was no sudden shift, no visible reaction, just a slight softening around her eyes, a subtle acknowledgement that something had moved forward, and she lowered the phone slowly, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window where the sunlight now fell more directly across the counter. And for a moment, she simply stood there, holding the space between response and silence. And then, with the same deliberate calm, she began to type, her fingers steady, her thoughts clear, and when she finished, she did not reread the message more than once, did not adjust or second-guess. She sent it, letting it go without attaching anything beyond what was written. And as she placed the phone back into her bag, the rhythm of the diner resumed around her, unchanged on the surface, but now carrying something new beneath it, something that connected her morning to a different part of the city, a different pace, a different world. And in his office, Alexander felt the subtle vibration of his phone against the desk, and when he picked it up, his eyes moved across her reply with the same focus he had given his own message. And as he read, a small shift occurred, not in his expression, but in his posture, in the way he stood, as if something had aligned just slightly more clearly than before, and he set the phone down, not rushing to respond again, not filling the moment with unnecessary emotion, because now, for the first time, the connection between them was no longer abstract. It was real, defined not by assumption or memory, but by choice. And that made everything that followed feel different, not because it was dramatic, but because it was intentional. The reply stayed with him longer than he expected, not because of what it said, but because of what it did not. And Alexander Hayes found himself reading it again hours later, not searching for hidden meaning, but noticing the clarity in its simplicity, because Emily Carter had not filled the message with politeness or hesitation. She had responded with the same precision she carried into every movement. And that alone shifted the way he approached the rest of his day, not slowing him down, not distracting him, but altering the weight of his decisions in small, almost imperceptible ways. And when the afternoon began to soften into early evening, the light outside his office shifting from sharp to warm, he made a choice that did not fit into his usual pattern, not because it was difficult, but because it was not calculated. And he reached for his phone again, this time without pause, without rehearsal. And he sent a second message, shorter than the first, clearer, suggesting a meeting. Not at a place he controlled, not at a venue designed to impress, but somewhere neutral, somewhere that allowed space instead of expectation. And across the city, Emily felt the vibration of her phone as she stepped out of the diner, her shift complete, the air cooler now, carrying the first hints of evening. And she paused on the sidewalk, the movement of people around her continuing in steady lines. Before reaching into her bag and pulling out the phone, her eyes moving across his message, with the same calm focus as before. And this time, there was a brief pause, slightly longer than the last, not because she was uncertain, but because she was considering not just the words, but the intention behind them. And she glanced down the street, the familiar path home stretching out in one direction, the unknown in another, and for a second, the city itself seemed to offer both options without preference, and she exhaled softly, her decision forming not from impulse, but from recognition. And she replied, her message just as measured, just as clear, confirming a time, adjusting a detail, meeting him halfway without conceding anything of herself. And when she sent it, she slipped the phone back into her bag and began to walk, her steps steady, her pace unchanged, but her direction now subtly different. And later that evening, the meeting place came into view, a small park tucked between buildings, its paths lined with trees that softened the edges of the city, the lights spaced evenly along the walkway, casting a gentle glow that made everything feel slightly removed from the rush beyond its borders. And Emily arrived first, not early, not late, simply on time, and she stood near one of the benches, her posture relaxed, her attention outward, observing the movement around her without focusing on any single point. And when Alexander approached, he did not announce himself, did not call out. He simply stepped into her line of sight, and she turned, meeting him with the same composed presence she had carried from the beginning. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement, because this was different from before, not defined by roles, not framed by expectations, just two people standing in a space that did not belong to either of them. And Alexander broke the silence first, his voice steady, his tone unforced. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, and she nodded slightly. "You asked." "Clearly," she replied, and there was something in that exchange, simple as it was, that set the tone for everything that followed, because neither of them was trying to control the moment, neither was performing. They were simply present, and they began to walk, not with a destination in mind, but with a shared direction, their steps aligning gradually, naturally, and as they moved along the path, the conversation unfolded in the same way, not rushed, not rehearsed, just steady. And Alexander found himself speaking differently than he usually did, not presenting, not persuading, just explaining, answering when she asked, pausing when she did not. And Emily listened with the same attention she gave everything else, not interrupting, not filling the space unnecessarily. And when she spoke, her words carried weight, not because they were many, but because they were chosen. And as the minutes passed, the city beyond the park continued its motion, distant and constant, while within that smaller space, Something quieter began to take shape, something not defined by status or circumstance, but by the simple act of two people choosing to understand each other without forcing the outcome. And when they finally slowed near the far end of the path, the lights behind them forming a soft line of memory rather than distance, Alexander glanced at her, not searching, not measuring, just noticing, and for the first time since that night in the restaurant, there was no question in his expression, only recognition, and Emily met his gaze briefly before looking ahead again. And though neither of them said it, both understood that whatever had begun with a single unexpected moment had now taken its next step, not louder, not larger, but deeper, and that made all the difference. The path curved gently toward the edge of the park where the city lights grew brighter again, and as Emily Carter and Alexander Hayes slowed their steps, the quiet space they had been walking through began to give way to the familiar rhythm of the streets beyond, but neither of them rushed to leave it, as if both understood that something within that calm had not yet fully settled, and Alexander glanced ahead, then back toward her, his expression thoughtful in a way that had become more natural, then deliberate. "You chose this place," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Emily nodded slightly, her gaze following the line of trees that framed the path. "It does not belong to anyone," she replied, and the simplicity of that answer carried more meaning than its words suggested, because it explained not just the location, but the way she approached everything, without claiming, without imposing, just allowing space for things to exist as they were, and Alexander absorbed that, the idea settling into his thoughts with a clarity that felt unfamiliar but welcome, because his world had always been built on ownership, on structure, on defining boundaries and controlling outcomes. And this was something else entirely, and they reached the end of the path where the park met the sidewalk, the transition marked not by a line, but by a shift in sound, in movement, in energy. And they stopped there for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of acknowledgement. Because this was where the evening could naturally conclude, where they could part without complication, and yet neither of them stepped away immediately, and Alexander turned slightly toward her, his posture relaxed, his voice steady. "There is an event tomorrow night," he said, choosing his words with care, not to persuade, but to present, "a charity gala, downtown. It is formal, structured, predictable." He paused briefly, a faint trace of self-awareness passing through his tone. "Everything." This was not, and Emily listened, her attention steady, not reacting to the description, but to the intention behind it, and he continued, "I would like you to come with me." And there it was, not framed as an obligation, not disguised as an opportunity, just a clear invitation, and the air between them held that moment without rushing to resolve it. And Emily considered it, not by looking at him, but by looking slightly past him, her gaze settling on the movement of people crossing the street, the steady flow of headlights and footsteps, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, measured. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, not dismissing, simply seeking clarity, and Alexander did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing how to say it without reducing it to something smaller than it was. "Because I want to see if what happened last night was a moment," he said finally, "or something that continues." And the honesty in that answer shifted the weight of the question, because it removed expectation and replaced it with intention, and Emily turned her gaze back to him, studying his expression briefly, not searching for hidden meaning, but confirming what was already present, and she nodded once, slowly. "Then I will come," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no condition attached, just agreement, and for a second, neither of them moved, the decision settling into place, altering the direction of what would follow, and Alexander inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried more respect than formality. 7 o'clock, he said. "I will send the details." And she acknowledged it with another small nod, before stepping back just enough to create the space that had not existed a moment before. And as they turned in opposite directions, the city reclaimed them, the sounds rising again, the lights brighter, the pace quicker. But something remained unchanged, something that had been established not through words, but through the way they had chosen to move through the space together. And as Emily walked down the sidewalk, her reflection briefly catching in a storefront window, she noticed the difference not in her appearance, but in her awareness, the way the night seemed to hold more possibility than it had the day before. And across the street, Alexander paused for a brief second before entering the car that waited for him, his hand resting lightly against the door as he looked back once, not to check if she was still there, but to mark the moment, to recognize it for what it was. And then he stepped inside, the door closing with the same quiet precision as before, and the car moved forward, carrying him back into a world that now felt slightly less defined, slightly more open. And in that space, between structure and possibility, something new continued to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that neither of them could ignore. The next evening arrived with a different kind of weight, not heavier, not more urgent, but more defined, as if the day itself had been leading toward a point that neither Emily Carter nor Alexander Hayes had rushed, yet both had anticipated in their own quiet ways. And as the city shifted from late afternoon into evening, the skyline catching the last traces of sunlight before surrendering to artificial glow, Emily stood in her apartment, the soft light from a single lamp casting gentle shadows across the room, and for a moment, she simply observed the space around her, the familiar objects, the small details that had remained unchanged through everything, grounding her in something steady, something real. And on the bed beside her lay the dress she had chosen, simple, elegant, not designed to impress but to exist without apology, and she reached for it with the same calm deliberation she brought to everything else, her movements unhurried, her thoughts clear, and as she prepared, there was no sense of transformation, no attempt to become something different, only a continuation of who she already was, expressed in a different setting, and across the city, in a space defined by glass walls and quiet efficiency. Alexander adjusted the cuff of his jacket, the reflection in the mirror precise, composed, but not rigid, and there was a subtle shift in his posture, not visible to anyone else, but present in the way he stood, less guarded, less performative, as if the evening ahead required something other than control. And when he stepped out into the waiting car, the door closing softly behind him, he did not review notes or check schedules. He simply allowed the drive to unfold, the city passing by in familiar patterns that now carried a different tone. And when the car pulled up to the entrance of the gala, the building illuminated in soft gold light, the steps leading up framed by polished glass and quiet movement, he stepped out, his gaze lifting briefly to take in the scene before settling, not searching, but aware. And inside, the event moved with a kind of practiced elegance, guests arriving in measured intervals, conversations forming in quiet clusters, the sound of music blending seamlessly into the background. And Emily arrived shortly after, not announced, not accompanied, simply stepping into the space with the same steady presence she carried everywhere else. And for a moment, the contrast between her and the room seemed apparent, not because she did not belong, but because she did not adjust herself to match it. She moved through it as she was, and that alone drew a different kind of attention, quieter, more curious. And when Alexander saw her, it was not immediate, not a sudden recognition, but a gradual awareness, as if his attention had already been aligned to find her, without effort. And he turned, his expression settling into something that was no longer shaped by expectation, and he walked toward her, not with urgency, not with display, just with purpose. And when he reached her, he paused for a brief second, the moment holding without tension. "You came," he said, and there was no surprise in it, only acknowledgement. And Emily met his gaze, her expression calm, her presence steady. "You asked clearly," she replied, echoing her earlier words in a way that grounded the moment in continuity rather than novelty. And he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried respect rather than formality, before offering his arm, not as a requirement, but as an option. And she accepted it without hesitation, not because it was expected, but because it was offered without condition. And together they moved into the room, their pace aligned, their presence shifting the space around them in subtle ways, not drawing attention through volume or display, but through the quiet clarity of their movement. And as they walked, conversations paused briefly, not out of recognition, but out of instinct, because something in the way they carried themselves altered the rhythm of the room. And Alexander noticed it, not with pride, not with calculation, but with a kind of quiet understanding. Because this was not about influence, it was about presence. And as they reached the center of the room, the music shifted slightly, the tempo adjusting, and Emily's gaze lifted toward the source, the familiar structure of the melody settling into something she recognized without needing to name it. And for a moment, the room seemed to narrow, not physically, but perceptually, as if everything else had softened at the edges, and Alexander followed her gaze, then looked back at her, his expression thoughtful. "It is a waltz," he said, not as an invitation. "Not yet, just as an observation," and Emily nodded slightly, her eyes steady. "Yes," she replied, and there was a quiet stillness in that exchange, a recognition of something that had begun elsewhere and now returned in a different form. And as the music continued, the space between them held that possibility, not rushed, not forced, but present, waiting for the moment to unfold. The music expanded through the room with a quiet authority, not loud enough to demand attention, but structured enough to guide it. And as the first full sequence of the waltz settled into place, Alexander Hayes turned slightly toward Emily Carter, his posture composed yet no longer distant, and without a word, he extended his hand, not as a challenge, not as a performance, but as a continuation, and for a brief second, the space between them held still, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because this moment was not the same as before. It was not framed by laughter or expectation. It carried a different weight, one built on everything that had unfolded since that night. And Emily looked at his hand, then at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and she placed her hand in his, the motion smooth, deliberate, and the connection felt immediate, not because it was new, but because it was understood. And they stepped onto the dance floor together, the polished surface reflecting the soft light above, the surrounding conversations fading slightly as attention shifted, not abruptly, but naturally, drawn by something that did not need to announce itself. And the first movement began, not led by command, but by alignment, their steps finding the rhythm without effort, the space between them defined by precision rather than distance. And Alexander followed differently this time, not trying to lead before understanding, not trying to control what he had not yet learned. And Emily did not guide him the way she had before. She moved with him, adjusting in real time, allowing the dance to exist between them rather than belonging to either one. And that difference changed everything, because the motion was no longer about correction, it was about connection. And as they turned, the room seemed to soften again, the edges of sound and movement fading just enough to bring the focus inward. And the music carried them through each sequence with a quiet consistency. The rise and fall of the rhythm mirrored in their steps. The subtle shifts in timing matched without being forced. And for a moment, Alexander allowed himself to fully experience it, not analyzing, not anticipating, just moving. And that alone marked a change greater than anything visible, because it was the absence of control that created the clarity. And Emily noticed it, not as a thought, but as a feeling. The difference in the way he held the space, the way he responded instead of directing. And she allowed that, meeting him in that balance without altering her own center. And as the dance progressed, the room around them became quieter, not in sound, but in attention, because what they were doing was no longer entertainment. It was something else, something that did not need to impress to be understood. And as they reached the midpoint of the sequence, Alexander spoke, his voice low, carried just enough to reach her without breaking the rhythm. "I was wrong," he said, and the words, simple and unguarded, settled into the movement without disrupting it. And Emily met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. "About what?" she asked, her tone just as quiet, just as steady, and he held her gaze for a fraction longer, not searching, not defending, just stating. "About thinking it was a moment," he said, and there was no elaboration, no attempt to explain beyond that, because the meaning was already there, woven into everything that had led them to this point. And Emily absorbed it, the honesty of it, the absence of performance, and she nodded once, a small motion that acknowledged not just his words, but the shift behind them. And the music carried them forward, the final sequence approaching with a natural progression, not rushed, not extended, just complete. And as they moved through the last turn, the space between them narrowing, slightly before opening again. The final note lingered in the air, soft and sustained, and then it resolved, leaving a silence that held for just a second longer than expected. And in that silence, neither of them stepped away immediately, not because they did not know what came next, but because they recognized that this moment, like the one before it, did not need to be rushed into conclusion. And when the sound of the room returned, the applause quieter, more deliberate, they remained where they were for a brief second longer, their hands still connected, their attention steady. And then, with the same calm precision that had defined everything else, Emily stepped back, releasing the connection without breaking it entirely, because what existed between them no longer depended on proximity. And Alexander lowered his hand slowly, his expression unchanged on the surface, but something beneath it had settled into certainty, not the kind built on control, but the kind that came from understanding. And as the room resumed its rhythm, conversations rising again, movement returning, the moment they had created did not disappear, it integrated, becoming part of the space rather than separate from it. And as they stepped off the dance floor together, not leading, not following, just aligned, it was clear that whatever had begun between them had moved beyond possibility and into something real, something that would not fade with the music, because it had already found its place. Beyond it, the room gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, conversations weaving back together, glasses lifted, quiet laughter resuming. But something had shifted beneath it all, something that did not need to be named to be felt. And as Emily Carter and Alexander Hayes stepped away from the dance floor, their pace unhurried, their presence steady, there was no sense of conclusion, only continuation. And they moved toward the quieter edge of the room, where the lights softened and the noise settled into the background. And for a moment they stood there without speaking, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding, because words, in that moment, felt secondary to what had already been made clear. And Alexander turned slightly toward her, his expression composed, but no longer guarded. And there was a stillness in him that had not existed before, not the stillness of control, but of certainty. And Emily met his gaze with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, her posture relaxed, her attention fully present. And for a brief second, the distance between them seemed to dissolve, not physically, but in the way they regarded each other, no longer defined by roles or expectations, but by recognition. And Alexander exhaled softly, the smallest release of something that had been held in place for far longer than he had realized. "I meant what I said," he said, his voice low, steady, not performing, not persuading, just stating. And Emily watched him, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, allowing the words to settle before responding. "So did I," she replied, and there was no elaboration, no need to clarify, because the meaning existed between them already, carried through everything they had experienced together. And he nodded once, absorbing that, not as confirmation, but as alignment. And the moment held, quiet and complete, before shifting naturally into something softer, something less defined by structure and more by presence. And they began to walk again, not toward the center of the room, not toward the exit, but along the perimeter, their movement unmarked by urgency. And as they passed through small clusters of guests, the attention they drew was different now, not curious, not questioning, but respectful, as if the space itself had adjusted to accommodate what they represented without needing explanation. And Emily noticed it, not as validation, but as a change in atmosphere, and she allowed it to pass without attaching meaning to it, because what mattered was not how the room responded, but how the moment felt. And beside her, Alexander carried that same awareness, the difference between being seen and being understood settling into something clear. And when they reached the far side of the room, where tall windows framed the city beyond, they paused again, the view stretching out beneath them in a quiet display of light and motion. And for a moment, they stood side by side, not speaking, just observing. And then Emily turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, but her tone carrying a subtle warmth that had not been there before. "You are different here," she said, not as a compliment, not as a critique, just as an observation. And Alexander considered it, his gaze shifting briefly from the city to her. "Because I am not trying to be the same," he replied, and the honesty of that answer settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty, and she nodded once, acknowledging it. And in that exchange, something else aligned, something that moved beyond curiosity and into understanding. And as the evening began to draw toward its natural close, the music softening, the crowd thinning, neither of them rushed to define what came next, because it no longer required definition. And when they finally stepped outside, the night air cool against their skin, the city alive in its usual way, the sounds and lights blending into a familiar rhythm. They paused at the top of the steps, the distance between them marked only by the space they chose to keep, and Alexander turned to her, not with expectation, not with uncertainty, but with a quiet clarity that had replaced both. "There was a time," he said, his voice steady, "when I would have tried to decide everything from the beginning." And he paused. The admission simple but significant. "I am glad I did not this time." And Emily met his gaze, her expression softening just slightly, enough to reveal what had been building beneath the surface. "So am I," she replied, and the words settled between them with a calm finality that did not end anything, but confirmed everything that had already begun. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the city continuing around them, indifferent yet somehow aligned. And then, without ceremony, without declaration, they stepped forward together, their pace matching naturally, their direction shared. And in that quiet alignment, something lasting took shape, not built on promises spoken in passing, but on choices made in stillness. And as they disappeared into the rhythm of the night, it was clear that what had started as a challenge had become something entirely different, something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. And in that choice, they had found not just each other, but a new way of moving through the world together. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like this video, share it with someone who believes in unexpected love. Share with us where you are watching from, and subscribe to Love After Everything channel for more powerful, emotional stories that remind us of what truly matters.